The moment I heard his voice on the other end of that phone, something in my chest locked up tight and never quite let go. "Don't come through the front door," my son's neighbor said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, like he was afraid the walls might be listening. "And don't let her know you're coming. There's something you need to see, something that changes everything." I stood in my kitchen holding that phone against my ear, 63 years old, 3 weeks out from burying my son, and I felt the floor shift under my feet like the whole world had just tilted 2 degrees to the left. That was the moment my life split into two halves, everything before that call and everything after. My son had been 38 years old, strong, careful, the kind of man who checked his tire pressure before every long drive and kept a first aid kit under the seat of his truck. He was not careless. He was not reckless. He did not take unnecessary risks with anything. Not his finances, not his health, not his physical safety. That was just who he was, who I raised him to be. Which is why, when the sheriff's deputy came to my door on a Saturday morning in October and told me my son had drowned in the lake behind his own house, I felt something that went beyond grief. Underneath the crying, underneath the shock, underneath the fog that follows you everywhere when you lose a child, there was something else. Something quiet and cold and persistent. It didn't make sense. My son had grown up on that lake. We bought that property together. I put in the down payment. He and his wife moved in. We had an arrangement. He'd fished that water since he was 11 years old. He could swim before he could ride a bike. And the report said he'd gone out on the dock alone at night and somehow gone over the edge. They found him face down in 4 feet of water at 6 in the morning. The medical examiner ruled it accidental drowning. Alcohol was listed as a contributing factor. My son didn't drink. I mean that literally, not he didn't drink much, or he was careful about it. He had stopped drinking entirely at 26 after a health scare, and in 12 years he had not touched a drop. His wife knew that. His doctor knew that. I knew that better than I knew almost anything. I said this to the deputy. I said it twice. He wrote something in his notepad and told me grief can make us remember people differently than they were. I did not argue. I drove home. I sat in the dark in my living room for 4 hours and I thought about my son. The weeks that followed were a specific kind of hell that only parents who've buried a child can understand. There is no manual. There is no roadmap. You wake up every morning and the knowledge is right there waiting for you, immediate and crushing, before you've even fully opened your eyes. My daughter-in-law was very composed throughout the funeral. I noticed it, but I told myself people grieve differently. Some people go quiet. Some people go practical. She made all the arrangements efficiently, chose the casket without much deliberation, handled the catering for the reception with a calm that I attributed to strength. She had the insurance paperwork on the kitchen table before the flowers at the grave had wilted. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was looking for someone to blame because blame feels better than helplessness. I told myself she'd been a good wife, or close enough, and that she was simply doing what needed to be done. Then she mentioned selling the lake house. It was a Wednesday evening, about 10 days after the funeral. I'd come over to pick up some of my son's things, his grandfather's watch, a box of photographs, and she brought it up the way you'd mention a grocery list. The house was too big for her alone, she said. It had too many memories. The market was good right now, she said. It would be better for both of us to have closure. I asked her what she meant by both of us. She reminded me, gently, that the house was in both their names, and that since I was on the original deed as a co-signer, any sale would require my agreement. But she had spoken to a real estate attorney, she said, and there were ways to proceed. I looked at her across the kitchen counter where my son used to stand and make his coffee every morning, and I felt that cold, quiet thing again. The thing underneath the grief. I told her I needed time to think. She said she understood completely. The call came 4 days later. A Thursday afternoon, just after 2. It was the man who lived in the gray house at the end of my son's road. He'd been a neighbor of theirs for 7 years. He was a retired pharmacist, widowed, kept to himself mostly, but he and my son had developed the kind of quiet friendship that forms between men who share a property line and a set of values. They looked out for each other's places, borrowed tools, waved from driveways. He told me not to come to the front door. He told me not to tell my daughter-in-law. I asked him what was going on. He said, "Your son came to me 6 weeks before he died. He was scared. I didn't know what to do with what he told me. And I have been carrying it ever since, and I cannot carry it anymore. I was in my car in under 3 minutes. He met me at his back gate and walked me through his yard to the side door of his garage. It smelled like motor oil and old newspapers. He had a folding table set up with a manila envelope on it and a coffee mug he clearly hadn't touched. He told me my son had come to him on a Tuesday evening, looked like he hadn't slept in days, and told him he was afraid of his wife. Let me sit with that sentence for a moment, because it took me weeks to fully absorb it. My son, my careful, quiet, steady son, had walked next door in the dark and told his neighbor that he was afraid of the woman he shared a bed with. He'd told the neighbor about the insurance policy first. A $2 million life insurance policy that his wife had taken out on him 14 months prior, which he'd signed without reading carefully, because she'd presented it as part of a financial planning package, bundled with other documents, and he hadn't thought to question it at the time. He'd only found out the amount after he'd stumbled across the paperwork while looking for their car registration. He told the neighbor about the pressure to change the deed on the lake house she'd been pushing him for almost a year, to remove my name from it and put it solely in hers for estate planning purposes. He told the neighbor about an argument they'd had in August, 2 months before his death, where she had said things that frightened him. He didn't repeat the exact words to the neighbor, but the neighbor told me his face had gone pale describing it. And then my son had told the neighbor something that made the old man's hands shake even now, standing in his garage telling me the story. My son had said, "I think she might actually do something. I don't know what to do. If I go to the police with just this, they'll think I'm crazy. But if I don't say anything to anyone, and something happens to me, I want at least one person to know." The neighbor had urged him to go to the police. My son had said he would think about it. He never came back. 6 weeks later, they found him face down in 4 feet of water. I stood in that garage and the floor did the tilting thing again. Worse this time, and I put my hand on the folding table to steady myself. The neighbor put his hand on my shoulder. Neither of us said anything. For a long time, then he picked up the manila envelope and held it out to me. Inside was a handwritten note, 2 pages, in my son's handwriting. Not a formal letter, more like notes he'd written to himself. A running list of things that had concerned him over the previous year. Dates, small incidents, things she'd said, things that, individually, might mean nothing but lined up together. In a column, in my son's careful block print, formed a picture I could not look away from. At the bottom of the second page, he'd written, "If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident." He had dated it September 14th. He died October 2nd. I drove home in a state I cannot fully describe. Not crying, I was past crying, or through it, or somewhere on the other side of it. Just a white, ringing clarity. The kind that comes when something you half knew becomes something you fully know and cannot unknow. I did not call my daughter-in-law. I did not call the sheriff's department that night. I had already learned what they did with things that didn't fit their paperwork. I called my son's cousin, who was an attorney in another county. Not to get legal advice yet, just to think out loud with someone I trusted. She listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You need to find out about that insurance policy, the full policy. And you need to find out whether there was an autopsy. And if so, what exactly they tested for." There had been an autopsy. It had found water in the lungs consistent with drowning, and a blood alcohol content of 9. My son, who had not consumed alcohol in 12 years. My son's cousin said, "Certain substances can be metabolized in ways that read as alcohol on a standard tox panel. You need to ask them what they tested for specifically and what they didn't." I wrote that down. I wrote down everything. The next 2 weeks were the most purposeful of my life and also the loneliest. I could not tell my daughter-in-law what I was doing. I could barely leave the house without calculating whether she might see my car in the wrong place at the wrong time. I started with the insurance company. I called and explained that I was the policyholder's father and that I had concerns about the circumstances of his death. They were professional and careful with their words. But the woman I spoke to, and I will always be grateful to her, said something that told me everything. Sir, I can confirm that the claim on this policy is currently under review. They were already looking. I went to the county medical examiner's office next and asked for a copy of the full autopsy report. It took 4 days and a formal written request, but I got it. My son's cousin went through it line by line with me over the phone on a Sunday afternoon. The standard toxicology screen had tested for common drugs and alcohol. It had not tested for GHB, gamma-hydroxybutyrate, a central nervous system depressant. Colorless, nearly tasteless, metabolizes rapidly. In sufficient doses, it causes disorientation, loss of motor control, unconsciousness. It converts to substances that a standard tox panel can misread as naturally occurring compounds, sometimes registering as elevated alcohol. The neighbor, the retired pharmacist, had told me about it. He'd looked it up after my son died and couldn't sleep. He hadn't wanted to believe his own research. I went back to the medical examiner and asked specifically about GHB. They told me it was not part of the standard panel. I asked whether it was too late to test for it. They told me that GHB degrades rapidly in tissue, and that given the time elapsed, a definitive test was unlikely to be conclusive. That felt like a wall. I sat in the parking lot of the medical examiner's office for a long time. Then I thought about what else I had. The note, the neighbor's testimony, the insurance policy, the blood alcohol reading on a man who didn't drink, the pressure to change the deed, the timeline, the argument in August. Maybe I couldn't prove the how, but maybe the how wasn't the only thing. I made an appointment with a detective in the major crimes unit of the county sheriff's office. Not the same deputy who'd come to my door, but someone senior, someone I'd found through my son's cousin. I brought everything. The note, a printed timeline I'd put together myself, the insurance documents I'd obtained through the claims review process, a written statement from the neighbor. The detective's name is not important. What's important is that she read every page. She didn't look up until she'd finished. When she did, she said, "When did you say this note was dated?" "September 14th, and the death was October 2nd. "Yes." She put the papers down flat on her desk and looked at me for a moment. "Sir," she said, "I want you to understand that what you've brought me is not nothing." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in a month. They reopened the investigation quietly. I wasn't supposed to know the details, but my son's cousin kept her ear to the ground and relayed what she could. The detective pulled phone records. She pulled financial records. She brought in the insurance company's investigators, who had apparently already flagged 3 prior insurance-related incidents connected to my daughter-in-law, 2 in other states, years earlier, neither resulting in charges. I didn't know any of that. None of us did. There had been a first husband. He had died in what was ruled a hiking accident in Colorado 7 years ago. There had been a boyfriend before that who had survived barely a carbon monoxide incident in an apartment they shared, which was attributed to a faulty heater. The woman I had smiled at across Thanksgiving tables. The woman who had stood at my son's grave in a black coat looking composed and sad. The woman I had, in those first awful weeks, almost felt sorry for. She had done this before. I remember the night my son's cousin called me with that information. I was sitting in the dark again, in the same chair I'd sat in the night of the deputy's visit. I listened, and I didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. Then I said, "He knew. He knew something was wrong, and he went next door to tell someone, and then he came home to her, and he didn't leave." My son's cousin was quiet. "Why didn't he leave?" I said, and my voice broke on the last word in a way I hadn't let it break in weeks. She said, "Sometimes people can't see all the way to the edge of what's happening to them. They know it's bad, but they can't quite believe it's that bad." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I still think about it. That might be the thing that will take the longest to make peace with, not the loss itself, but the knowledge that he was afraid. And he reached out to one person, and then he went back. And I was not there, and I did not know, and I could not help him. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. But I did not let it stop me from doing what needed to be done. They arrested my daughter-in-law on a Tuesday morning in February, 4 months after my son died. She was at the lake house, still living there, still in the process of trying to force the sale. I found out later that the real estate agent she'd hired had actually been scheduled to come out that Thursday for a listing appointment. I was not there for the arrest. The detective had asked me not to be, and I understood why. But my son's cousin was monitoring the public records, and she called me within an hour. I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee and watched the light come up over the neighbor's fence. The oak tree my wife had planted before she passed was still bare from winter, but there were small, tight buds on the branches that I hadn't noticed before that morning. The charges were first-degree murder and fraud. The prosecution intended to argue premeditation based on the insurance timeline, the prior incidents, the note, and the neighbor's testimony. They brought in a forensic toxicologist who testified about the metabolic profile of GHB and what a standard panel would and would not catch. They brought in the investigator from the insurance company. They brought in a detective from Colorado who had never quite been satisfied with the ruling on the first husband. The trial lasted 11 days. I sat in that courtroom every single day. I sat in the same seat, near the aisle, 4 rows back. I watched the jury. I watched my daughter-in-law, who maintained throughout the entire proceedings the same composed, careful expression she had worn at my son's funeral. I thought about my son writing his notes in careful block print on September 14th, listing the things that scared him, not knowing he had 18 days left. The jury was out for 9 hours. When they came back in, I watched the foreperson stand up, and I put my hands flat on my knees, and I breathed. Guilty. On all counts. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 45 years, no possibility of parole for 30. The judge read from my son's note during her statement. She said it was one of the most deliberate and chilling pieces of evidence she had seen in 30 years on the bench. My daughter-in-law showed no expression as the sentence was read. I showed mine. I couldn't help it. I cried in that courtroom for the first time since the whole thing began, not from relief. Exactly. And not quite from grief, but from something in between. The particular sorrow of a truth that comes too late to save the person it was about. That was 8 months ago. The lake house is mine, now fully mine, the deed finally cleared. I have not decided what to do with it. Some mornings I think I'll sell it and never go back. Other mornings I drive out there before sunrise and sit on the dock where my son used to fish when he was a boy, where I taught him to cast a line when he was 7 years old, where he stood with rubber boots and more patience than any child has a right to have, and I watch the water. It is just water. It does what water does. It doesn't know what happened on its surface. It doesn't carry any of it. I find that both unbearable and comforting, depending on the morning. The neighbor still lives at the end of the road. We have coffee sometimes. He doesn't say much about it, neither do I, but there's an understanding between us now that goes deeper than 7 years of borrowed tools and waved hellos. He was the one person my son trusted with the truth. He carried it until he couldn't anymore, and then he called me, and that call changed what was possible. I think about who else might be out there in a situation like my son's, afraid, telling one person, hoping someone listens. I think about what I would say to them. If I could, I'd say, write it down, date it, give it to someone. More than one someone if you can. Don't wait to have proof that something will happen. The fear itself is information. The fear itself means something. Someone who loves you will believe you, if you let them. I wish my son had called me. I wish I had known enough to ask. There are things we can't go back and fix. There are conversations we can't go back and have. There are 18 days between September 14th and October 2nd that I would trade almost anything to undo. But there is also this. My son wrote his fear down. He handed it to someone, and that piece of paper, those 2 pages in his block print handwriting, put the woman who killed him in a cell where she will spend the rest of her useful life. He did that. He reached out, even when he was afraid, even when he didn't quite believe it was that bad. Some part of him knew enough to leave a record. I am grateful for that part of him every single day. I keep the note in a box on my nightstand. Not because I need to read it, I have it memorized by now, but because it's his handwriting, and on the nights when the grief is the loudest, I can put my hand on the box in the dark and feel the weight of it, and remind myself that he was here. And he was known, and he is not forgotten. He never will be. That is what I have left to give him now, not protection, which I wish I could have given, but memory, witness, the refusal to let what happened to him become a quiet footnote, an accidental drowning, a closed case on a shelf. He deserved better than that. He got it. Eventually, and whatever it cost me to make sure of that every sleepless night, every document, every hour in that courtroom, I would pay it again, without hesitation. That's what you do for your son. That's what you do for your child. You don't stop. You don't accept what doesn't make sense. You don't let them tell you that grief distorts your memory of who someone was. You trust what you know. You follow what you know. You keep going until the truth has nowhere left to hide. And then you sit on the dock in the early morning, in the quiet before the world gets loud, and you say his name out loud to the water and the oak trees and the bare November sky, and you let yourself miss him completely. And then you get up, and you keep going.